Well, I can tell you, you've come a long way from those days at that poetry club back at Berkeley High School to now you've got this big premiere at Tribeca with your best friend. I guess my first question is, what was it about David when you first met him that knew you wanted to hang with him?
I don't, we met in high school, man. I don't know that we did want to hang out. I think we saw each other at the poetry events, and like, I was trying to be, we had very different intentions. I was trying to be the best. Like, there wasn't a Def Poetry yet, but like when Def Poetry came around, I was like, oh, I'm gonna be on that show. Like it was, I think I was taking it way more seriously. I think David was like, oh, here's another like fun way I can, share a little bit of writing. And, I think theater and sports were maybe a bigger priority for him at the time. But then he went off to college, man, and he got heavy into music. And I was opening a recording studio in North Oakland when I was about 18 or 19. And somebody brought him through, a buddy of ours, Justin Carey, who was in the show and in the movie, brought him through and was like, hey, man, you gotta hear Diggs's music. And he played a couple songs, man. And I was like, hey, this motherfucker's good, man. He's like, he can, in my little group of friends, there wasn't a lot of people who could keep up, and Diggs was, killing it, man. So we started recording music together, and we had a really great rapport. And we just kind of kept making art together and became fast friends, like within days. And now I don't really remember sort of a period where we weren't kind of best friends. It was just like I didn't really hang out with him, and then we were best friends, and then it's just been that for the last 20 years.
Listen, I have a best friend that lives in town where I live, and he's probably 11 miles at most from where my house is, and I don't see him probably nearly as much as you see your best friend. And I can tell you unequivocally, I wouldn't move all the way to New York from California to be with him, but you did that because I mean that's friendship, man. I mean that bond must have meant the world to you.
Well, yeah, and I mean there were a lot of reasons I moved to New York, man. We had both moved to LA 5 years before that together to pursue our careers, man, to like no avail. Like the shit did not go well. Like we recorded a ton of music, and like he was doing clipping, and we were doing projects together, and we were living in the same house together there. And then this thing started happening for him in New York. I think really what, I was seeing what my close friends become famous in a way that neither of us really ever anticipated. And that can be a very scary thing for your mental health. And so I was a little worried about him, one. And then two, I think there was an artistic community in New York that we had never had before that was thriving in that way, man. Like I met Jasmine, and I met Ant, and I met Javi backstage, and I met some of the people that were in his cohort, and there was an artistic moment happening in New York. And I was like, that's exciting. I need that. Like my art needs to be around that. And so when I came to New York, it was like, all right, I'm going to find a way to work at the public theater somehow. And I'm going to hang out at the stage, and I'm going to soak up some of this creative energy. And I'm going to be here and support the shit out of my friend and make sure that like he feels like he's got some stable part of his life to hold on to, while New York is kind of treating him like he's the Beatles, because that's a whirlwind, man. Like I saw it, man. I saw people freaking out, and I was like, this is crazy. Like you got to have people around you that love you to make it through that. As anyone from that cast knows, you got to have your people. And that's my dude. And he's shown up for me like that a lot in my life, man, a lot. Where I've needed somebody to be solid because crazy shit was going on, and that motherfucker pulled up, over and over and over again. And so it was my turn to pull up. Also, I never lived in New York, and I thought that shit was gonna be cool.
New York's fucking cool, man. I'm with you, but I can tell you that's probably the moment that really set this whole path to where we are today with the premiere of Blindspotting. Now, I love the film. Without question, it was one of my favorite films when it released that year. But what I loved about your series, and by the way, your series is fantastic. I don't know if you, no, it really is. I'm gonna tell you why it's fantastic. There's a lot of people who take that adaptation from the big screen to TV and they stick to the same beats. You all sat down and you were like, we're gonna take this in another direction. and we're going to make sure it's right. And it's funny, it's touching, it touches on, you know, topics that matter. I mean, it's a great show, and you have a lot to be proud of. How long did it take from that decision that you made to go from, you know, the big screen to TV to getting it just right?
I mean, you know, that pivot was really because we didn't really want to make the TV show. You know, like I think if we had aspirations to like flip the property and do a thing, we probably would have ruined it, you know. But I think because we were sort of, it was somewhat forced upon us, this question of like, is there any way you would do the show? And we made the point on the way to a meeting to tell them absolutely not, to ask ourselves honestly if there's a version of it that we would ever do. And we just kind of were like, well, since we don't want to, like, is there a version we would want to watch? And we're like, well, the only version we really want to watch is like a version that centers a lot of the women that like raised us, and that maybe like would be more about Ashley's character, because we only got a couple scenes with her in the movie, and we really loved what she did with that character, and that could be a gateway into a bunch of other stories. And so I think setting that as our like sticking point and not bending on it was really sort of the turning point of trying to get it right. And then we involved a lot of people that we brought in writers that we loved, who were, some of them were like first-time TV writers, but we knew that they understood the world and us and the language of the movie. So we brought in Alana Brown and Nigel Mumin and Priscilla Garcia Jaquer and Ben Turner, who plays Earl on the show. And like, that was the room. Ben, Alana, Priscilla, never written for television before. Nigel, one time. But we had a shorthand with them where we could have like really honest conversations about these characters. And I think in hindsight, that's the thing I'm most grateful for now, is we were like sent a bunch of writers, you know, samples to be like, here are people you can hire. They've worked on this show and this show and this show, and they've done this show. And I was like, we're never going to get there if it's people that we don't know, who may not feel comfortable being honest with us, because we're two dudes working on a show that centers women. Like we have to tread very lightly here. We have to make sure that we're not the God voice of the show. And so I think we tried to set up a ton of checks and balances to make sure that like these characters and their dynamics could be developed properly and in a really safe space. Because with Blindspotting, like the way that David and I found our way to the truth of the thing was really, really honest conversations, you know? And I think that was the part of the recipe that had to be replicated.
And a lot of shows wouldn't go to that length to find people you could have that shorthand with. And that's why I think the show is successful, because not every idea is going to be the right idea. And you need people who can tell you what's going to work, what's not going to work, and people who understand where this is taking place. Okay. And I think that's why your show's going to be a big hit, as far as I'm concerned. And what I love about it is that with the focus on women, these are women who, in this neighborhood, often don't get the appropriate praise and the spotlight in these type of shows. You're giving them the spotlight. You're showing them what they do behind the scenes to get, you know, they raised David. I mean, these are the women that need the spotlight, and this show does it.
I think, I think the allure for me of the show is when people haven't seen it yet, they ask me and David, like, well, what about Colin and Miles? What about Colin and Miles? And I think our response is always like, 10 minutes into the show, you're not going to be that worried about that. And I think once you get into Ashley and Trish and Janelle and Helen and, you know, once that starts, man, like, that's the show. It's so interesting, you know, and it isn't like, we're trying to show the unsung protagonists. It's like, these are the fucking protagonists.
They are
in our lives. They are like, it's that it's not being necessarily reflected as much on television and film, but like, these are, like, growing up, these were the main characters. You know, in a lot of ways, we were the side characters. And so I think the fun of the show is starting with these, you know, few characters, but because we shot in COVID, everything had to be really small, you know, a couple characters in a scene at the most. Because we just, you know, we're in like, you know, stormtrooper masks all the time. But as the show grows, hopefully we'll just get to keep expanding and introducing newer characters that I think will just kind of double and triple down on the thing we're trying to do.
I think it's a love letter to all those mothers in Oakland who did the work and got those children raised on the bigger and better things, as far as I can see it. And
really, like, you know, I think the show is also trying to expand sort of the definition of what we're talking about. Like it is the Bay, you know, like Oakland in the movie is a centerpiece in a different way, because we're talking about gentrification in a specific neighborhood. Like, we picked West Oakland, one, because Diggs and I were living there at the time that we were writing it, and a lot of our friends, like, sort of born and raised from that neighborhood. And so we felt like we could talk about gentrification there, right? Because it's a really common topic, and we like have lived on the ground there and, like, you know, grew up in the East Bay, and we know that world. But I think when we get to the show is a little bit less about the neighborhood and a little bit more about the Bay, and about what Bay Area culture is, and the kind of people that are there, and the kind of music, and the kind of sort of multiculturalism that exists in the Bay that is really unique to that place. And that's the thing that's getting sort of erased at this point, because gentrification isn't just in Oakland. It already happened in Berkeley in the 90s and 2000s. It's been happening in San Francisco for the last fucking 20 years, but really intensely in the last 10. And Oakland is getting hit the fucking hardest now. But that's the Bay Area, man. Like, every once in a while I'll go look and be like, I wonder if I'll ever be able to afford a house in the Bay. And like, the last time I looked, it was like, there was the price, which was insane. And then the thing sold for $400,000 over the asking price. I'm like, what chance do local people have?
They don't.
To hold on to their culture, to hold on to our shit, things that, like, that defined us, you know, that have already vanished, man. Like, I grew up really heavy in Berkeley, right? Like, I'm a Berkeley kid first. Mm-hmm. And Berkeley is unrecognizable from the city that I grew up in. It's fucking different. I don't know any of these people. Like, I go walking around and I'm like, what? They're like, everyone's gone. And everyone in Berkeley moved to fucking Oakland, and then moved to, you know, Stockton, and moved to, you know, like, the landscape is shifting under our feet all the time. So I think the show is really about, like, hey, we need to show this like very hippie hood multicultural upbringing that we all had. It was super unique to the area, because people are not going to believe us that it existed, you know?
Yeah.
Like, they're just not even going to think that it's real.
Now, I will tell you, and I will end on this note, and it's an important note, and I really appreciate your time. I know you're busy. Your coup, the coup of the show, in my opinion, was getting Helen Hunt. I mean, Jesus Christ. When I saw y'all casted Helen, I was like, damn, they're serious about this. And then when I saw her on the show, I was like, perfect casting. And then I find out through my research, you two were hanging, watching movies, and at one point, and developing a bond. I mean, how did that happen? And is that accurate that you two were hanging at one point watching movies?
Yeah, man. And still, man, you know, we went and saw In the Heights together 2 days ago, and then went and got some pizza and hung around. Like, you know, I think we got very fortunate where Helen loved the movie, loved it, and tweeted about it. My recollection is that I slid in her DMs when I saw the tweet, because I was actually in the middle of watching Twister, which was random. But I just happened to be rewatching Twister, which I hadn't watched in like 10 years. And I remember that I slid in her DMs, but I saw her in an interview say that she slid in mine, which may be true. She may be remembering it better than me. But we started talking, and I'm like, the next day we went out to lunch, because we're both in LA, and she was like, I love being around writers and creative people, and I love the work that you're doing. We should know each other. And we just started hanging, you know, like, we just immediately hit it off. I felt like I understood her as a person, and there's a lot of similarities between her and you know, women that I grew up around or under, my, you know, like there's an artistic sort of conversation that's happening between the two of us that I just find just really fulfilling. And there's just so much, she just gives me so much love. She's so, you know, like, she didn't have to, like, just take me and David in the way that she did. And so we, like, you know, most of the pandemic, when we weren't working, we were like on her front lawn watching movies, and then we'd watch, you know, some great film, and then we'd sit there and we'd talk about it for an hour or two with, like, you know, 7 or 8 other people all spread out on blankets, and just like dissecting performance and writing and, you know, directorial and, you know, intention. And it's just been this, like, really, really beautiful, unexpected friendship. And when it came to, you know, we made the joke early on, oh, you should totally play Miles's mom on the show. How crazy would that be? And she was like, yeah, crazy, you know, and then like, let that go, you know? And when the show came around, it was like, we just got to ask her. We got to ask her, but leave the door way open for her to say no, because like, if she doesn't want to do it, or we don't want her to be polite and to get, you know, when you start like crossing like friendships and work stuff, you just want to be really careful with the thing that people cherish most about their own lives. And so we presented it to her and she was like, it's not a no, but I want to talk about this character. And then we just had like a ton of conversations about who Rainey was and what kind of person she would be and who is she like. And then we brought in friends and family from our community to like hang out and talk with her so she could get a sense of what Rainey would be like and what Trish would be like as a daughter. And then eventually, like after a bunch of sort of notes of her, again, helping us build the character, because we're not white women from the Bay in our 50s. We don't, you know, we're trying our best to write our moms and write our aunts, you know, like we're trying our best. But finally we got to a place where she was like, I know this character. I want to play this character. And I think we just like, we're floored. I still can't believe she's on the show. Like I kind of can't believe it.